Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Devine, and I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Omri Brunner. We are part of ITSS Verona in the International Systems and World Order team, focusing in on the Middle East. Today, we are joined by award-winning TV host and host of Indus News, Waqar Rizvi, to discuss about the recent presidential Iranian election. So Waqar, in the run-up to the election, it seemed there was only one possible candidate who could win. Was it always a foregone conclusion that Ibrahim Raisi was going to win the presidential election?
Firstly, thanks for having me, John and Omri. It's good to be with you both. That's one argument. And yes, I know that's an argument that's been made a lot, especially both within the country and outside. But there's also another argument, another way of looking at this. I'm just going to put this out there just for the sake of perspective, because there is the argument that's been made that the Rouhani administration did no favors for the reformist camp in the country, which is obviously the more liberal leaning party in the country. So because of the entire failure of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and Rouhani not having a plan B to save the economy and to preserve Iran's national interests, as he's been criticized for by Iranians, both liberal and conservative leaning, it essentially then became almost just a referendum on just the reformist camp, more so than just the person of Raisi to an extent. Now, that's not to take away from Raisi himself and his win, but I'm just saying that there is also that context which needs to be taken into account, because that also then adds another layer to this. It's not as simple as just saying Raisi was appointed and or chosen. Yes, I mean, certainly there is the argument made even within the country that the Guardian Council did not do a good job of vetting candidates. And that's even something that conservative leaning Iranians who are pro-system, and I mean pro-governing system, are also unhappy to an extent about that, not all of them. That said, though, I think it's too simplistic to do either of these explanations. I think it's these as well as other layers which we need to add on.
Okay. But in terms of the Guardian Council, they prevented a number of candidates from running. And do you think this can account for the historically low turnout in the presidential election? Because my understanding, there's 60 million eligible voters in Iran, and about 28 million participated in this election. So
the turnout is definitely something that they're worried about, and there's been talk about that already. I've spoken to a number of Iranian experts, and they've tried to explain it away, saying that, listen, this was also during a pandemic, and people were worried, rightly so probably, about whether or not SOPs would be followed, especially in such large crowds and such confined places such as mosques, etc., where a lot of the polling stations are. I don't have a comment on whether or not that's true or not. I mean, that may very well be true. It may very well have deterred some people from coming out, but we still cannot explain a 50% or less than 50% turnout, depending on which estimates of the turnout you believe. I think it's just down to the fact that a lot of people, yes, were unhappy with the candidates who were sitting in these elections, and B, there is a certain level of just anger towards the political elite. That doesn't, again, necessarily mean the system. So, I mean, I don't want us to get carried away. There are times when people will say that, listen, because people are not voting for Raisi, Himmati, or any of the other two candidates, Ghazizadeh or Rizai, that means that they're against the entire governing system. That's an overstatement. There are certainly, yes, people in Iran who are against the governing system. I know such people as well who would like, for example, the Shah's son to come back today and, rule over the country. But that doesn't, again, mean that's the majority. I think it's just there is genuine anger against the political elite, and that's obviously going to be a huge obstacle for the Raisi administration as well to overcome.
Mr. Rizvi, can you say anything about the turnout of the young Iranians in the recent elections? Did they vote more than usual, or rather, of the 50% that did vote, only a small minority of the voters were young?
To be honest, Omri, I haven't seen a breakdown, so I'm not going to give an exact comment on that, but I will say from what I saw, and I do have a number of young Iranians who I follow, who are more activists. I would say that they were very passionate about what's happening in the country, as Iranians are. Their society was extremely politically aware. So as far as whether or not they voted or not, I mean, I know of some who are, for example, were very liberal leaning, leaning in the context of Iran, mind you. So we're not talking, when we say liberal and conservative in an Iranian context, it's not a Western context. We need to remove that from our minds for a moment. We're talking about within the Iranian context, liberal and conservative. Within that context, there were people who were against Raisi, and they yet encouraged their friends to come out and vote. So I saw a lot of Instagram stories, posts, Twitter accounts who were set up just to encourage people to vote so that their respective candidate would get the support. So I think that there was probably a mix of the two. The young people, as you know, right now are going through either unemployment or underemployment in the country, and the economy is suffering. Iran has a huge population of young people, very educated, largely a lot of women who are extremely educated as well. We know that in university entrance exams, women do very, very well, and they get into some of the tougher subjects. So I think that there probably is, logically speaking, a lot of unhappiness on their part regarding how the economy is going. So if they choose to then blame that on the political elite, I don't think that the political elite cannot then blame anybody but themselves. I know friends who, even though they're extremely educated, are having a hard time financially as well, right?
From your experience in Iran, can you tell us a little bit about Elections Day? How festive is it? How big is it?
Election Day, it's sometimes touted as being a test or a referendum on the entire governing system. So on the Islamic Republic itself. That's something which top down you will hear from officials. I think it's less simplistic than that, as we've seen in these elections, as I've already said. I think it's less a referendum on the Islamic Republic, or at least in these elections, I think it was less of a referendum on the Islamic Republic. Again, that does not mean that there are not people who do not support the Islamic Republic within the country, but I think it's much too simplistic to view it just from that narrative. So as far as it being festive, yes, there are many, many people who view this as their duty, national duty, and some even religious duty. So we had a lot of very old people. I mean, this happens in many parts of the world where there are some form of elections. So you have very, very old people, coming in wheelchairs, some in pretty bad health conditions coming to vote because they were insistent that they wanted to take part in these elections. Some of them are Iran-Iraq war veterans, their spouses, their family members. So, for them, these sorts of elections hold even more value because it's something that their respective spouses and or other male family members may have died for. So people have a variety of reasons for why they may vote. As far as it being festive, yes, I mean, there was this trend on social media where some people use the hashtag Jashin Intikhab, which in Farsi means, celebration of the vote, or, I'm not doing a very good job translating it, but it's along those lines. And you could describe it as a celebration, but I think that would probably be an overstatement.
You said how it's a referendum on the political system. From my discussion with Iranians, there seems to be a big disconnect between the president and the supreme leader. Do you think this low turnout might seem to affect the legitimacy of the president?
I think that people are just disappointed, right? So I don't want to keep harping on Rouhani, but it's easy to criticize him, right? Because he just genuinely did mess up. And I mean, I can criticize previous presidents too, mind you. Even Ahmadinejad has a lot to say. There's a lot to say about his legacy as well. But I think that, yes, there's just this annoyance about the fact that he overpromised what would happen through the JCPOA. I know that Zarif is much liked around the world, Foreign Minister Zarif, but there's a video of him in Farsi essentially screaming at lawmakers who were questioning him before the deal was signed, saying that I promise you that all the sanctions will be lifted tomorrow, all the sanctions will be lifted tomorrow. And he insists on that, and obviously we know that never actually happened. The banking sanctions were actually never lifted, even under the Obama years. So I think that there is this disconnect between the people and the president, more so than the people and the rest of the system. As far as the relationship between the presidential office and the supreme leader's office goes, we have to remember that, as with many countries around the world, it's not as simple as just a president and or a prime minister and how they rule the country. There are always competing political bodies which influence how then respective leaders then react, right? So in Iran, there's always this very delicate balancing act, which the leader plays, i.e. Ayatollah Khamenei, as well as the president, and you need to keep all of the above happy. So it's not as simple as you saying, okay, I want to put forth this policy. You need to really consult a number of councils and committees and people, and you need to ensure that they're on board so that they don't reject you outright at parliament and or in other bodies, because then that will create a lot of headaches for you. So it's not as simple as just a relationship between the presidential office and the leader's office. It's the president as well as a whole bunch of other people, and then the leader as well. So it's a lot more complex than we might see from the outside.
Can you please tell us a little bit about the connection and the relations between Raisi and Khamenei?
So yeah, I mean, they definitely know each other very well. They've worked together very well over the years. He's been appointed by Ayatollah Khamenei to various positions that he has held over these years. You know, and the Chief Justice position that he currently holds is certainly one that he was appointed to as well by the leader. So he's certainly, I mean, the word protege, I think, is still an overstatement, as a lot of media are using. He is definitely somebody who has the ear of Ayatollah Khamenei, but that does not necessarily mean that everything he says or does is an extension of Ayatollah Khamenei, or vice versa, right? So this is, I think, a question of, and I think Ayatollah Khamenei has probably learned this while he's been in this position, is that he does not then express too much support for anybody outright, as in carte blanche support for anybody, because I think there have been times where certain politicians have gone expressly against what he's wanted them to do, and they've gotten away with it to an extent for various reasons. So I think he's learned that he also keeps a lot of his opinions reserved about specific people. We'll have to wait and see what Raisi's track record is. It's really hard to say at this early stage what that specific relationship will be like going forward.
Could you quickly explain to us how hardline is Raisi? Because in the media, he's depicted as a very tough, very hardliner politician. But what does this actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, so hardliner and ultra-conservative are the two words I've seen used to describe Raisi a lot. And, you know, and I've used this too, actually, as a journalist myself, and I got called out on it by a lot of Iranians, and they're not completely incorrect. So, I mean, you know, I understand the context, because again, they keep saying, listen, you're looking at this again from an outsider's point of view, and you're not giving us the benefit of the doubt that within the country, hardliner versus reformist within the context of Iran means extremely different things from what we understand outside the country. So all of these men and women, those who are politicians, are working still within this system that exists, right? So for a lot of us on the outside in the Western world, the entire system is hardline. You know what I mean? So if you have a hardliner within the hardline system, I mean, sort of you're just repeating yourself almost, right? To many, even Rouhani was hardliner. I've seen articles about how Rouhani was too centrist and or hardline. So how hardline Raisi will be? Yes, I mean, if you look at his track record, he's certainly been very pro-system throughout his career, and that's what's brought him to the current position that he holds, i.e. Chief Justice and now President-elect. There's no doubt about that. So he's proven his loyalty, so to speak. Does that mean that only somebody who is conservative can be loyal to the system? No. I mean, we've had the reformist presidents. We've had people like Rouhani who, however much you may criticize them, and people have even called him traitor or treasonous. I've seen such headlines in Iranian media. Even that is an overstatement and an over-exaggeration. He is still very much loyal to the system. But yes, for the system, he is a bit more reformist / liberal than others would be. So the terminology needs to be understood again within that very specific context.
Okay. And could you briefly just explain to us, what is the biggest area that Iranians want to see improved within Iran? Is it the economy? Is it COVID relief? Is it the sanctions? What is it that they want to see improved?
Well, obviously the sanctions are top of the list, as well as then the economy, right? So, and the pandemic, I think a lot of Iranians, yes, have been disappointed in how the world has reacted towards their country, even during the pandemic. So, you know, we weren't able to, unfortunately, have countries put aside their differences with Iran and help Iran, at least in the Western world, right? So we've had the Chinese and or others more allied to Iran who've been able to help the country Again, to an extent, they also have their national interests, which they preserve. But yes, the economy and sanctions are always top of the list. So the Vienna talks, as you know, are still very much ongoing to try to revive the JCPOA, essentially to have the Americans come back in. Whether or not that happens or not is, it's still too hard to say. Sanctions are extremely important, but then at the same time, there's a lot of talk about mismanagement and corruption within the country. And Raisi ran on a platform of anti-corruption, saying that he's going to be extremely tough on corrupt officials. And that's one thing which has also worked against previous presidents. Even during the Ahmadinejad years, mind you, there were a lot of accusations of corruption. He was, a conservative leaner. But during the Rouhani years, it's been a lot more blatant, unfortunately, or those news have come out a lot more about officials and the high life that they're living while their people are, sanctioned and are having a hard time, some of them finding basic special drugs like, for cancer patients and otherwise. So those sorts of things have really, again, irked people within the country, both conservative and reformist. And so I think that those issues, if Raisi is able to actually do a good job on that, will really probably win him some brownie points with the people.
Now, we've discussed a lot of local stuff in Iran in terms of the elections and Raisi. Regionally, do you think his reign or his tenure will have a dramatic effect on Iran's role in the region, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq? How do you see?
Foreign policy. You know what I mean? Foreign policy usually remains fairly consistent, regardless of a reformist or conservative office. It's just the face that changes, right? So I'll agree very much that Foreign Minister Zarif was a very good diplomat, and he was really able to improve Iran's image in the world. Rouhani wasn't bad in himself, but because Zarif speaks very good English, that really helped. And Zarif, had befriended a lot of the American diplomats or knew them from before during his time when he was studying in the US. So that really helped the country. That said, yes, Raisi may very well choose to come in and say he wants to be a lot more tough, which is not completely unexpected. I would think that even if you had a reformist who won at this juncture, because we're talking about a world which is post Donald Trump walking away from the deal, post Soleimani, Fakhrizadeh assassination. So, the Iranian trust of anybody beyond the Iranian borders is at an all-time low. And I'm going to borrow a term that Zarif used even during the nuclear negotiations. He said there's a deficit of trust between Iran and the United States. I think that deficit of trust at this point in time extends from Iran to the rest of the world, really. So Iran is viewing everybody with mistrust because it's lost an extremely important general and another nuclear scientist and nuclear officials. So that will heavily influence policies going forward, but I don't think it would have been that different under a reformist president. I just think that, yes, the Americans may find it harder to want to come to a deal with a conservative president because they would have rather helped or supported a reformist, as they chose to do during the Rouhani years by signing the deal with him instead of Ahmadinejad. You'll remember that this nuclear deal didn't just happen overnight, right? This was negotiated for many years, even before Rouhani came into office. So they could have chosen to do this and finalize this during the Ahmadinejad years, but they didn't want to give him that win, right? That PR, public PR, international public PR. So whether or not the Americans choose to do that or not is, that's a question for the Americans.
Exactly. That would make me believe that the Americans would want to sign the deal before Raisi comes into office. So rather re-sign the deal with Rouhani rather than Raisi, as if not to be in the same table, in the same boat as with Raisi.
I think it's probably, I will say this though now. I think that had the Americans wanted to do it, you and I both know, and all three of us know, that if the Americans wanted to actually support Rouhani, they would have already done it. So Biden could very well have chosen to fast track this process, send a whole, he's also obviously sent a huge team to Vienna, but an even larger team, finalize this, get it done during the Rouhani administration way in advance of these elections. The fact that the Americans did not do that probably means that there might actually be okay. This might be the first time they might be okay signing a deal with a conservative president. We don't know what's their thought process at this time, but if they had wanted to support Rouhani, they very well could have done it. It would have been a huge win for Rouhani and the reformist camp. But the fact that Biden chose not to do it, that might be a sign that there still is hope.
And we've discussed about the international implications, but in terms of the regional, we know there are talks ongoing between Iran and Saudi Arabia about their influence within the region. How do you think Raisi coming into office will affect these talks?
Right. So during the Ahmadinejad years, there was a slight opening between the Iranians and the Saudis. And the only reason I bring that up is because Ahmadinejad would also be seen on par with Raisi, at least during his presidential years. So Ahmadinejad visited Saudi Arabia. He was invited by the king at that time to even perform the Hajj pilgrimage on the Saudi invitation. So that was a huge deal at that time. During the Rouhani years, because of Yemen, Syria, and a whole host of other issues, there's been a lot of tensions about what's happened in the Persian Gulf, ships, Saudi Aramco, there's a whole long list. And so I think that right now there's also another huge factor, and that is that I think the Saudis also possibly see that the Americans want to lessen their role in the Middle East. So that possibly, and I guess this is just me, grasping at things and what I've read from Saudi analysts, is that the Saudis may be feeling like, maybe it's time for us to take the reins of our own policies, and maybe rapprochement with Iran is not the worst thing that could happen for them. Yes, there's a lot that these countries disagree on, a lot. So I don't think we're ever going to come to a relationship which is going to be, even cordial necessarily publicly, but maybe they can just learn to live with each other in a stable but predictable relationship, as Biden likes to say, with Russia and America. So maybe we can come to that sort of, an understanding. On top of this, though, we have right in the mix of all this, the Abraham Accords, which I think really changes the calculation in the region for the Saudis as well, even though the Saudis have said at this point they are not going to be normalizing ties with Israel. Nevertheless, that is at the back of the mind of the Iranians. So can they really trust the Saudis? They're probably trying to gauge that as well.
Right. So more cooperation, less conflict, especially conflict through proxies in the region. Yeah, I definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that will end. I'll be honest with you. I don't know that will end. I think it's too early to say. I think proxy covert warfare, I think very much will continue. I mean, it's not like the Iranians are going to walk away from Syria, or they're going to stop their influence, or, as they call it, moral support to the Yemeni Houthis, as well as, Iraq and all that stuff. I don't think the Iranians are going to just say, we'll step back. So I don't think they're looking to do that either. Saudis are certainly not going to step back, but I think they're just going to try to figure out a way that they can both live with each other's presence, both in the region as a whole, and then in these respective countries as well.
Well, coexistence is preferred over war, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I'm afraid that's time. So, Waqar, thank you so much for your time this evening and for answering our questions.
Thank you very much, John. I had a really good time. Fun.
Waqar, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure meeting you.